The sun bled slowly over the horizon, casting a golden haze across the fields. Clara stood at the kitchen sink, hands buried in soap suds, eyes fixed on the barn where Henry had disappeared hours ago. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoed faintly, a familiar sound, one that marked the cadence of her life on the farm. She dried her hands on a worn towel, the fabric frayed like the edges of her patience. At 36, Clara had begun to feel invisible. Her days blurred into one another, feeding chickens, mending fences, cooking meals that went half-praised, half-eaten. Henry, her husband, was a good man by all accounts. Hard-working, steady, unshakable. But love had quietly evaporated from their marriage, replaced by habit and obligation. Clara couldn't remember the last time he looked at her, really looked at her, with softness, with desire, with anything beyond the dull familiarity of routine. She didn't blame him entirely. The farm consumed him. Every conversation circled back to crop yields or livestock. Every gesture of affection had become mechanical, like the creak of the porch swing that hadn't held the two of them together in years. When the phone rang last week with news that James would be arriving for the summer, Clara felt an emotion she hadn't in a long time: anticipation. James was Henry's nephew, though he'd always felt more like a distant cousin to Clara. She hadn't seen him since he was a lanky teenager, all elbows and awkward smiles. But now, at 24, he was returning, a man, supposedly, to help on the farm while figuring out his next steps in life. Clara heard the truck before she saw it. Dust kicked up from the gravel road as it rolled into the driveway. She stepped onto the porch, squinting against the setting sun. The door swung open, and James stepped out, taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulders, his hair longer, curling slightly at the ends. He wore a casual confidence in his walk, a lightness she hadn't seen in years. "Aunt Clara," he said, smiling wide, his voice deeper now, warmer. She smiled back, a bit surprised by the sudden flutter in her chest. "Look at you," she said, stepping down from the porch. "You've grown." James laughed. "Yeah, I'm not the awkward teenager anymore." He hugged her, a firm, affectionate embrace, and Clara found herself holding her breath for a moment too long. She pulled back quickly, brushing off the strange sensation. Inside, she busied herself preparing dinner, glancing occasionally at James as he unpacked in the guest room. Henry returned just in time for supper, covered in dust and grease. His conversation with James was surface level, filled with practical questions about the tractor and crop rotation. Clara sat mostly silent, listening, smiling when appropriate, but her mind wandered. Later that evening, after Henry retreated to bed early, Clara found James on the porch swing, gazing up at the stars. "City doesn't have skies like this," he said without looking at her. She sat beside him, careful to keep space between their bodies. "No, it doesn't." There was a pause, comfortable and easy. "I always liked it here," James said softly. "It's quiet, peaceful." Clara glanced at him. "Sometimes it's too quiet." He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "You ever get lonely out here?" The question caught her off guard. Too direct, too perceptive. She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. "Sometimes," she finally said, barely a whisper. James didn't push. He just nodded, as if he understood something unspoken. The swing creaked beneath them, swaying gently in the warm evening air. That night, Clara lay in bed next to Henry, staring at the ceiling. His back was turned, his breathing heavy and even. Her mind, however, was restless. James had been in the house less than a day, and already, something had shifted. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was awareness, a sense of being seen, acknowledged, even if just for a fleeting moment. She closed her eyes, but her thoughts lingered in the silence, on the way James looked at her, on the question he'd asked, and the answer she wasn't ready to admit aloud. The summer had only just begun, but Clara sensed it wouldn't pass quietly. The days fell into rhythm, marked by early sunrises, dusty afternoons, and the low hum of cicadas echoing through the fields. Clara noticed the small changes first: The way laughter returned to the house, light and spontaneous, echoing down hallways that had grown used to silence. James proved to be more than just an extra pair of hands. He was eager, thoughtful, always finding ways to help beyond what was asked. He fixed the broken gate without prompting, offered to repaint the old barn doors, and even remembered to bring Clara wildflowers on his way back from the orchard, a gesture that startled her more than it should have. "They're just daisies," he said with a shrug, handing them over casually. But Clara stood there longer than necessary, fingers brushing the petals. No one had brought her flowers in years. Not even Henry. She began to look forward to their shared tasks. Morning chores became conversations. James asked questions not about the farm, but about her. Her childhood, her dreams, what she used to love before life became routine. Clara hadn't spoken about herself in so long that her answers felt strange in her own mouth, like dusted-off relics she'd almost forgotten she possessed. One afternoon, while sorting crates in the cellar, James turned toward her abruptly. "Did you ever want kids?" he asked. The question hit harder than she expected. "I did," Clara said quietly, not meeting his eyes. But life didn't turn out that way. James nodded, sensing the heaviness in her tone. "You'd have been a great mom," he said, voice gentle, genuine. Something in her chest constricted. She looked up at him, then really looked, and for a second, the room felt too small, too still. His gaze held hers, steady and warm. It was the first time she allowed herself to admit what she was feeling, not just appreciation, but something unspoken, blooming beneath the surface. Later, while peeling potatoes by the sink, Clara caught herself humming. It startled her. Happiness, even this fragile version of it, felt unfamiliar. But guilt crept in, soft and insidious. She began noticing her own thoughts, how often they drifted to James, how much she anticipated his presence, how her heart quickened at the sound of his footsteps. She tried to create distance, subtle at first, shorter conversations, cooler responses. But James noticed. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked one evening, leaning against the doorway as she folded laundry. "No," she said too quickly. "Of course not. You've just been different lately." Clara hesitated. "I'm just tired. The heat's getting to me." But they both knew it wasn't the sun that had unsettled her. Another evening, a storm rolled in. The wind rattled the windows, and heavy clouds swallowed the sky. Clara rushed outside to bring in the linens from the line, but the downpour hit faster than expected. Soaked and slipping in the mud, she cursed under her breath until James appeared beside her, grabbing the last sheet, laughing as the wind snapped it like a sail. "You'll catch a cold," he said, following her into the barn for shelter. They stood there, dripping, breathless, adrenaline from the rainstorm still buzzing between them. James shook water from his hair, grinning, and for a moment, Clara forgot herself, forgot everything but the way his eyes softened when they landed on her. "You're beautiful like this," he said suddenly. "Natural. Real." Clara froze. The words struck her like thunder. She wanted to laugh it off, pretend she hadn't heard, but the silence afterward carried a weight neither of them knew how to break. "I shouldn't have said that," James added quickly. I don't know. It slipped." But it hadn't. The truth never slips. It presses forward, waiting for the right moment to be heard. Clara turned away, heart pounding. "We should get back," she said, her voice low, trembling slightly. They walked back through the rain in silence. That night, as she lay in bed beside Henry, his breathing deep and oblivious, Clara stared at the ceiling again. The sheets smelled of rain. Her skin still tingled where James's fingers had brushed hers. It was nothing, she told herself. But something had begun, slow, invisible, like roots pushing through the soil beneath her feet. Clara had grown skilled at pretending not to notice the way James's presence lingered long after he'd left a room. Pretending her pulse didn't race when their fingers brushed while passing tools or shared a meal. Pretending her marriage was whole, not hollowed out by years of quiet neglect. But pretending had its limits. One afternoon, as Clara knelt in the garden pulling weeds, James crouched beside her, wiping sweat from his brow. "You don't talk much these days," he said softly. "I'm tired," she replied, her voice clipped. He studied her for a moment. "No, it's something else." Clara avoided his gaze, her hands trembling slightly beneath the weight of her gloves. "I think I've done something wrong," James added. She looked up, meeting his eyes, a mistake. There was no accusation in them, only concern. And something else. Something unspoken. "No," she said, standing abruptly. "You haven't done anything." But the lie hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Inside the house, she scrubbed the sink harder than necessary, as if scouring the feelings clinging to her skin. The more she tried to bury them, the more they bloomed. Guilt coiled tight in her stomach, a constant, gnawing ache. Henry remained oblivious, consumed by the routine of his days. He talked about rainfall patterns and the new feed shipment with the same monotone indifference, never noticing the storm building inside his wife. That night, Clara wandered into the kitchen after midnight, unable to sleep. The moonlight cast long shadows across the wooden floor. She found James at the back porch, staring out into the dark fields. "Can't sleep either?" he asked without turning. "No," she said, joining him. They stood quietly, the air thick with things unsaid. "I shouldn't be here," Clara whispered. James turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because this isn't right," she replied. "Whatever this is, whatever's happening, it's wrong." He stepped closer, slowly, cautiously. "Nothing's happened." "Not yet," she said, voice cracking. "But it's there between us." James didn't deny it. "I know," he said. "But I didn't ask for this. I didn't come here thinking." Clara nodded. "I know. Neither did I." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it was charged, a fragile thread threatening to snap. James reached out gently, fingers grazing her hand. She didn't pull away. The contact was barely a touch, yet it rippled through her like a current. "You make me feel seen," Clara said softly. "Like I'm alive again." James's eyes darkened with emotion. "You are." The words shouldn't have comforted her, but they did. They burrowed deep into a part of her she had long forgotten. Then came the rain, sudden, heavy, drumming against the porch roof. Neither moved. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one inside Clara's chest. In the following days, they avoided each other, both trying to retreat into distance. Clara busied herself obsessively, scrubbing floors, rearranging cupboards, finding tasks where none were needed. But even in silence, James's presence clung to the air like the scent of wildflowers, delicate, intoxicating, inescapable. The final fracture came one evening when Henry was called away for a livestock emergency in a neighboring town. He left just before sunset, muttering instructions about feeding the calves before he vanished down the road in his truck. Clara was alone again, except she wasn't. She found James in the barn, stacking feed bags. The golden light from the setting sun filtered through the slats, casting long shadows across the dirt floor. "I thought you'd be inside," he said, not looking up. "I couldn't sit still," Clara replied, her voice almost inaudible. James turned then, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither moved. The space between them felt weighted, electric. "I can't keep pretending," Clara said suddenly, her voice cracking. "I've tried, James. I really have." He stepped toward her slowly, as if afraid she'd vanish. "I don't want you to pretend," he said. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for him, a hesitant, trembling gesture. And in the quiet barn, they crossed the line they'd danced around for weeks. It wasn't passion that ignited first, but relief, two lost souls clinging to something that made them feel real again. The kiss was gentle, almost reverent, filled with longing and pain. There were no declarations, no promises, only the truth of a moment that couldn't be undone. When it was over, they stood in silence. Clara's heart thudded in her chest, heavy with consequences. "We shouldn't have," she whispered. "I know," James said softly. But it was too late. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful anymore. It was guilt, growing louder with every breath. The morning after felt strangely hollow. The sun rose like it always did, casting soft light over the fields, but to Clara, everything felt muted. The colors, the air, even the birdsong, all dulled beneath the weight of what had happened. James was already in the barn when she stepped outside. He didn't look up, didn't greet her like he used to. There was no shared glance, no flicker of acknowledgement. Just the thud of hay bales hitting the floor and the creak of old wooden beams. Clara stood at the threshold, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. She turned away instead, her chest tightening. Back in the kitchen, she moved through her routine like a ghost. The eggs sizzled in the pan, coffee brewed in the pot, and Henry returned home just after dawn, smelling like sweat and livestock. He dropped his bag at the door and kissed her on the cheek. She flinched, barely, but enough for him to notice. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice tired but curious. "Just tired," Clara said, offering a half-smile. She couldn't tell if he believed her or simply chose not to dig deeper. Either way, the wall between them thickened. Over the following days, the house grew heavier. The energy that once sparked between her and James had dissolved into something tense, fragile. They avoided being alone together. When they spoke, it was clipped, transactional, hollow of warmth. Their connection had been consumed by the act that had once promised to make them feel alive. Clara tried to return to normal, cooking, cleaning, sitting with Henry during dinner while nodding through conversations about feed prices and weather patterns. But the guilt gnawed at her, subtle and constant, like a loose thread she couldn't stop pulling. One afternoon, she found James sitting by the old fence near the east pasture, staring into the distance. "I'm leaving," he said before she could speak. Clara's heart dropped. "Leaving? Where will you go?" "Back to the city. I've got a friend who can help me find a place. I wasn't meant to stay here this long, anyway." She searched his face for resentment, blame, anything. But his expression was unreadable, calm, detached. "You don't have to go," she said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. "Yes, I do," James replied. "Staying would only make it worse. For both of us." He stood, brushing dust from his jeans. "I didn't come here to destroy anything." "You didn't," she whispered. He gave a small nod, then walked away. That night, Clara sat at the kitchen table long after Henry had gone to bed. The journal she'd started years ago lay open in front of her. She picked up a pen and began to write, not for confession, but to remember how it all happened. Not just the affair, but the quiet before it, the loneliness, the ache for something she couldn't name. The choices she made, the consequences she now lived with. She didn't know what Henry suspected. He never asked, never pried. But something in him shifted too. His touch grew gentler, his voice softer. He began to linger longer at meals, watching her in the way he hadn't in years, almost as if he knew something had slipped through the cracks and he was trying, in his own quiet way, to patch the fracture without asking how it formed. James left 2 mornings later, his goodbye brief and impersonal. No parting words, no hidden glance. Just a packed bag, a nod, and the sound of tires crunching down the gravel road. Life resumed or tried to. But Clara carried the silence he left behind like a second skin, invisible but impossible to shed. She still smiled, still baked bread, still folded Henry's shirts and kissed his cheek. But something fundamental had changed. Not just in her, but in the way she saw the world, its fragility, its unpredictability, the way one moment of hunger could unravel years of stability. Sometimes, she sat by the window and stared out at the fence where James once stood. Not with longing, but with a strange mix of sorrow and clarity. She didn't know if what happened between them was love or just a desperate cry for connection, a moment of escape, a reckless dive into the unfamiliar. But she knew it would stay with her, not as a flame, but as an echo. Quiet, persistent, unforgettable. Some betrayals are loud. Others are quiet, buried beneath smiles, buried in routines, buried where no one will ever see them, except the person who committed them. And that, Clara realized, was its own kind of punishment.